I have sat on this bench long enough to know that most people who walk through that door are nervous. They fidget, they check their notes, they glance around the room trying to figure out where to put their hands. That nervousness, in my experience, is not a sign of guilt. It is a sign of humanity. It is what happens when an ordinary person steps into a room where the truth is going to be told, and they are not entirely certain they are ready for what that means. Diane Hargrove was not nervous. She walked into my courtroom that Tuesday morning the way certain people walk into every room they enter, with the slow, measured certainty of someone who has decided in advance that the space belongs to them. Her suit was immaculate. Her posture was precise. She carried a slim leather folder at her side, held loosely, the way you carry something you brought only because someone told you that you were supposed to. She made it clear from the moment she crossed the threshold that she did not need it. I watched her scan the room, not the way most people scan a courtroom, looking for reassurance, checking exits, finding a familiar face. She scanned it the way a landowner surveys property, taking inventory, finding nothing particularly impressive, confirming that her arrival was the most significant event in the space. Her eyes moved briefly to the plaintiff's table, where Rosa Mendes sat with both hands folded over a thick folder of documents, her eyes red from crying she had clearly been doing long before that morning. Diane Hargrove looked at her the way you look at a minor inconvenience, then looked away. And then she did something I have not experienced in all my years on this bench. Before I had called the case, before the proceedings had formally opened, before a single word had been entered into the record, she leaned toward me with the casual ease of someone accustomed to having quiet conversations in powerful rooms. And she said, clearly enough that every microphone in that courtroom caught every syllable, "Judge, I'd strongly advise you to wrap this up quickly and in my favor. My husband has friends everywhere, including people who decide which shows stay on the air." The room went still. I mean that in the most literal sense. Every person in that courtroom, the bailiff, the production staff, the audience members, every single one of them stopped. The way people stop when they have just heard something so far outside the boundaries of normal human behavior that their brains need an extra moment to confirm what their ears just delivered. I looked at her. I did not respond right away. I did not need to. I picked up my pen. I wrote down what she had said, word for word, exactly as she had said it. I set my pen aside. I folded my hands on the desk and I waited, because I already knew everything. My team had spent 72 hours building a file on Diane Hargrove, on her foundation, on her husband's office, on a decade of coordinated institutional power used as a private weapon against ordinary people who had made the mistake of standing in her way. 4 people who reviewed that file used the same word, independently, to describe what it contained: explosive. The folder sitting beneath my bench was 4 inches thick, and Diane Hargrove, sitting across from me with the practiced composure of a woman who had not lost a single public confrontation in 22 years, had no idea it existed. But before I tell you what was inside it, I need to tell you about Rosa Mendes, because this case was never really about Diane Hargrove. It was about Rosa. And if you want to understand what justice means, not as a concept, not as a word we use in courtrooms, but as something real, something that cost people something, then you need to understand who Rosa was and what she had already survived before she ever sat down across from me. If you're watching this for the first time, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on your notifications, because what Rosa Mendes endured to reach this courtroom and what happened when Diane Hargrove finally ran out of room to run is unlike anything I have witnessed in my years on this bench. Stay with me. Rosa Mendes had been a school nurse at Westfield Elementary for 11 years. 11 years. She knew every child in that building by name. She worked double shifts during flu season without being asked. She had received the district's Employee Recognition Award 3 separate times, a laminated certificate she kept in a frame above her desk at home, next to a photograph of her mother, Esperanza, who had cleaned office buildings in the pre-dawn hours for 26 years so that Rosa would have options she herself had never been given. 11 years of showing up, 11 years of doing the work, 11 years of being exactly the kind of person that every institution claims it wants, and then, when it matters, fails to protect. 6 months before she sat down in my courtroom, Rosa had stayed late at the school to complete health records. The following morning, walking to a supply closet, she opened a door she had opened 100 times before and found 2 uniformed officers from Commissioner Hargrove's department meeting privately with a man Rosa recognized immediately. His photograph had been shown at a community meeting. His name had been spoken during a gang violence awareness presentation run by the same police department whose officers were now meeting with him, alone, in a room they had no business being in. Rosa stood in that doorway for 3 seconds. One of the officers told her to close the door. She did. She walked back to her desk, sat down, and made a decision that I want you to understand clearly, because it is the kind of decision most people never have to make and never fully appreciate. She decided to go back, phone in hand, through a cracked door and photograph what she had seen. She knew, even as she was doing it, that this was the kind of decision that changes the shape of a life. She knew it, and she did it anyway. She went home, she uploaded the photographs to a secure cloud account, she printed 2 sets of copies, and the following morning, she filed a formal complaint with the city's Civilian Oversight Board, the only independent body she knew of that operated outside the commissioner's direct jurisdiction. She filed that complaint because she believed the system would work, because she had spent 44 years living by the rules, doing what was right, trusting that the institutions built to protect people would protect people when it mattered. What happened next is what brought her to my courtroom. 14 days after she filed that complaint, she was suspended from her job. The charges had been initiated by the school district's board chairman, a man who had attended the Hargrove Foundation's annual gala every year for 6 years running, whose photograph with Diane Hargrove appeared on the foundation's own website 3 separate times. Her nursing license was flagged for administrative review. The anonymous complaint that triggered the review contained factual errors so basic that her attorney, while she still had one, described it as a document filed by someone who had never once met Rosa Mendes. Her landlord, whose building expansion was operating under a zoning variance approved by the commissioner's office, doubled her rent without notice and began eviction proceedings the following week. And when Rosa used the last of her savings to retain an attorney who had agreed to take her case on a reduced fee, that attorney received a visit at his office from 2 plainclothes officers who offered no official reason for calling. He withdrew from the case the next morning by email. "Irreconcilable scheduling conflicts," he wrote. I want you to sit with that for a moment. Her job, her license, her home, her attorney, not taken all at once, one at a time, methodically, by people who knew exactly what they were doing and had done it before. The way you dismantle something not with a single blow, but piece by piece, until the person standing inside it can no longer remember what it looked like when it was whole. Rosa did not have money. She did not have connections. She did not have a father who had spent decades collecting favors across every institution in the city. What she had was a phone with photographs stored in a cloud account, a folder of documentation that every official body had declined to acknowledge, and a belief, the kind that doesn't feel like a choice anymore, the kind that functions like a biological fact. The truth eventually finds somewhere to go. She had tried every door in the city. Everyone had been closed before she could finish knocking. She came to my courtroom because it was the only one left. Now let me tell you about Diane Hargrove. Not the version she performs at charity galas. Not the woman quoted in city magazines about her passion for community investment. The version that 17 people who crossed her in the past decade had learned to recognize. The version that operates quietly, methodically, and without hesitation when someone makes the mistake of standing in her way. She grew up the daughter of Alderman Frank Cavello, a man who spent 30 years running the 4th Ward with the cheerful corruption of someone who had never once been asked to follow the same rules as everyone else. He understood leverage. He understood that in a city built on favors, the most powerful person in any room is never the one with the most money or the loudest voice. It is the one who knows the most about everyone else and is willing to use it. He taught his daughter this. Not through lectures, but through example, letting her sit at the kitchen table while he made calls, received visitors, explained in plain language why a certain contractor would be getting a certain city project and what that contractor would be providing in return. Power, Frank Cavello told his daughter when she was 12 years old, is not what you have, it is what other people believe you can do to them. She never forgot it. When she married Richard Hargrove 22 years ago, then a rising lieutenant with political ambitions and a talent for managing the right relationships, Diane did not step into a supporting role. She stepped into a partnership. And over 2 decades, she made herself the more operationally effective half of it. Richard held the badge, the title, the press conferences. Diane held everything else. The board seats, the invitation lists, the carefully maintained ledger of favors, owed, extended, and called in across every institution the city contained. She had had lawsuits buried by ensuring the attorneys who might have taken them found their professional circumstances suddenly complicated. She had ended careers with a single phone call. She had had a journalist's press credentials pulled within 48 hours of his publishing a story even tangentially connected to her name. He never published another word about the commissioner's office. Nobody did. Not for years. She had never lost publicly. Not once. The efficiency of that kind of power is that it never needs to be demonstrated. Everyone already knows what you can do, and so nobody ever makes you prove it.
Diane Hargrove walked into my courtroom that Tuesday morning as a woman who had genuinely never faced a consequence she couldn't redirect, reassign, or erase before it reached her doorstep, which made what she had done to Rosa Mendes not an aberration, a routine. 3 weeks before that morning, a former city internal affairs investigator named Daniel Marsh had walked into the production offices of my show carrying a file he had spent 18 months building alone, at considerable personal risk after resigning from the department rather than participate in the burial of a witness intimidation complaint that had been removed from his desk by someone 3 ranks above him. He had kept copies of everything. What he brought me was a financial trail connecting the police union's political action committee to the Hargrove Community Foundation. Sworn statements from 6 former city employees, each of them targeted within 60 days of filing complaints against the commissioner's office, each of them losing positions, licenses, or facing legal action from parties with documented connections to the Hargrove Foundation's donor network. And a paper trail connecting 4 separate professional licensing reviews to anonymous complaints filed from an email address registered to a server inside the commissioner's own administrative building. When Rosa's case arrived on my desk, I recognized immediately that what I was looking at was not a harassment dispute. It was the surface of something much larger and much older. I read every page of Daniel Marsh's file. My team verified every document, cross-referenced every date, confirmed every name. And when I walked into that courtroom and watched Diane Hargrove make her entrance, I already knew everything. Every financial transfer, every buried complaint, every door that had been shut in Rosa Mendes's face, and exactly who had shut it. The folder beneath my bench was 4 inches thick. I did not bring it to show Diane Hargrove what I knew. I brought it so I could choose, with precision, exactly the right moment to use it. Diane's opening statement was what I expected, delivered with the warm, measured authority of a woman who has spent years speaking to rooms too politely afraid to push back. She described herself as a pillar of community service, a philanthropist,
a private citizen targeted by a disgruntled former employee. She painted Rosa's complaint as manufactured misconduct, designed to deflect from Rosa's own professional failures. She never once used Rosa's name, not in 10 minutes of speaking. Rosa Mendes, 11 years of service, 3 recognition awards, a mother, a daughter, a woman who had given everything to that school, was referred to throughout as this woman. This woman filed a complaint. This woman has workplace difficulties. This woman, Your Honor, is why we are here having this deeply unfortunate conversation. Deeply unfortunate, as if what had been done to Rosa was a minor scheduling conflict rather than the systematic dismantling of an innocent person's entire life. She laid 3 character reference letters on the table with the ceremony of someone playing cards they believed could not be beaten. A city councilman, the school board chairman, a retired federal judge. She folded her hands over them and leaned back, a woman who considered the matter essentially closed. Then Rosa spoke. Her voice broke within the first 30 seconds. She made no attempt to stop it because there was nothing performed about her grief. She described the storage room, the 3 seconds in the doorway, going home, making the decision she knew would change her life, filing the complaint and waiting, truly believing the system would respond because she had spent 44 years living as though it would. She described watching everything she had built get taken apart, one piece at a time. Her children changed schools after being taunted in the hallways. Her mother called and asked, in a voice barely above a whisper, whether Rosa had done something wrong. I let the testimony settle. Then I turned to Diane. Mrs. Hargrove, I said, keeping my voice even, are you familiar with the city's Civilian Oversight Board complaint process? She gave me a tolerant smile. Of course, it's largely performative. These boards rarely carry any real authority. I wrote that down. I write things down not to remember them. I already remember them. But so that the person across from me understands that what they have just said is now part of the permanent record, and we will be coming back to it. When Rosa began presenting her photographs, Diane raised a hand and sharpened her voice. Your Honor, those images are taken out of context. I'd like to know how she obtained them legally. I raised my palm to stop her. She gave a small, dismissive flick of her wrist, the gesture of someone swatting away a comment from a subordinate. The bailiff stepped forward. The audience murmured. Diane noticed neither. I pressed her through the timeline. The suspension filed 14 days after the complaint. The license review triggered by an anonymous filing. The attorney who withdrew by email the morning after receiving 2 unannounced visitors. Each time I pressed, her answers grew slower, flatter, less certain, as if she were pulling them from somewhere that was running dry. Then she said it again. Judge, institutions protect themselves. That's not something I controlled, and I gently remind you that my husband oversees the department that provides security for this building. I set my pen down. I folded my hands. I looked at her, and I gave her that silence, not out of theater, but out of something closer to sorrow. Because in more than 30 years on this bench, I have sat across from liars, manipulators, bullies, and people who had done genuinely terrible things. And almost every one of them, when the moment came, showed some flicker of recognition, some understanding that they were in a room where the truth would be told and they could not stop it. Diane Hargrove had threatened this court twice in the same morning, and the expression on her face said she genuinely believed it would work. Something shifted behind her eyes at around the 8th second of silence. The first crack in 22 years of undefeated certainty. Subscribe right now and hit that notification bell, because what I'm about to pull from beneath this bench is the moment Diane Hargrove's entire world begins to come apart in real time on camera. Don't go anywhere. I reached beneath my bench and placed the folder on the desk. I did not slam it. I set it down. But the sound it made, that thick, heavy sound of 4 inches of documented truth landing on a wooden surface, carried across every corner of that courtroom. Diane's eyes went to it involuntarily, and in the half second before she pulled her composure back into place, something crossed her face that had not been there at any point in the preceding hour. Not fear, something that comes before fear. The cold, faint recognition that the room she was sitting in might not be operating according to the rules she had spent 22 years mastering. It lasted less than a second, but I saw it, and so did every camera in that room. Before we continue, I said, I'd like to share some information I've gathered about the context surrounding this case. I removed the first document and set it flat on the record. A financial summary, 3 years of donation records from the Hargrove Community Foundation, cross-referenced against the city's active vendor contract registry. $340,000 in contributions received over 36 months from companies holding active city contracts issued through Commissioner Hargrove's office. Mrs. Hargrove, is it common for city contractors to donate to your personal foundation while simultaneously holding contracts approved by your husband's department? Her first answer was smooth. Community investment, the tradition of corporate philanthropy. I asked the question again, slightly differently framed. Her second answer came more slowly. I placed a second document beside the first, specific dates the contracts were approved, specific dates the donations were received. Her third answer did not come at all. I moved to the next document. I read from 4 sworn statements, a building inspector, a licensing officer, a social services coordinator, a civilian oversight board member. Each of them had filed formal misconduct complaints against the commissioner's office. Each of them, within 60 days of filing, had lost a position, had a license flagged, or faced legal action from parties with documented connections to the Hargrove Foundation's donor network. I read them without editorial, just the names and the dates. The complaint filed on March 4th, the termination notice issued on April 19th, the complaint filed on August 12th, the license review initiated on September 30th, the complaint filed on January 7th, the lawsuit served on February 28th. I read them evenly, without inflection, and I let the arithmetic of the pattern make every argument that needed to be made. By the third name, the audience had gone completely still. By the fourth, Diane's attorney had set down his pen and had not picked it up again. Then I held up a single sheet of paper, a parking permit issued by the Commissioner's Department, registered to a vehicle belonging to Rosa's former attorney, time-stamped to the evening of the day he had received his unannounced office visit from 2 plainclothes officers, the same evening that preceded his withdrawal from Rosa's case by approximately 14 hours. I held it long enough for every camera to capture it clearly. Interesting timing, Mrs. Hargrove. I set it down. By this point, Diane's face had stopped performing warmth entirely. It was performing control. Jaw slightly set, eyes slightly fixed, the stillness of someone concentrating very hard on not allowing their expression to move. It looked nothing like the face that had walked into my courtroom that morning. Those 2 expressions were separated by 22 years of invulnerability, and that invulnerability was dissolving in real time, right there across the desk from me. Mrs. Hargrove, I said, earlier this morning, before these proceedings opened, you referenced the security detail overseen by your husband. You referenced it again during testimony. I want to ask you directly, for the record, were you suggesting that your husband's position should in any way influence the outcome of these proceedings? She opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. 3 beats of silence while she cycled through possible answers and found each one more dangerous than the last. I was simply stating a fact, she said. Yes, I said, you were. I closed the folder, I set it aside, all the way to the side, with the deliberate finality of someone putting down a tool whose work is complete. The courtroom understood what that meant without being told. I leaned forward, both forearms on the desk, and I looked at Diane Hargrove the way I have looked at every person who has ever sat across this bench from me, not as a judge looking at a defendant, but as one human being looking at another, refusing to look away. I kept my voice quiet. I have learned over the years that the quieter the voice, the more weight it carries. Shouting fills a room and fades. Quiet goes somewhere. Mrs. Hargrove, I said, who do you think makes your husband possible? 9 words. The courtroom stopped breathing. Her mouth moved, the beginning of a word that never arrived, because there was no safe answer to that question. Every path it opened led directly into something I had already placed on the record. She couldn't say the city without pointing to Rosa, to the oversight board, to every good faith citizen Rosa represented in that chair. She couldn't say the law without pointing to the sworn statements, the foundation payments, the parking permit time-stamped to the night an attorney was pressured to abandon his client. She couldn't say the people with 22 years of documented behavior toward the people sitting 3 feet away in a 4-inch folder. There was no answer. There was only the question, hanging in that courtroom like something load-bearing, like a beam removed from a structure that was still, for one impossible moment, standing. 15 seconds, 20, her hands motionless and controlled through every document and every date and every parking permit began to move. Small, involuntary adjustments. Fingers finding the edge of her folder and straightening it without reason. Her right hand touching her left earring briefly. Her arm reaching slightly to the right for a glass of water that wasn't there. The reaching hand finding nothing, returning to the table. 30 seconds. 35. When she spoke, the voice that came out was not the voice that had opened these proceedings. It was not the gala voice, the authority voice, the voice that had told me, before we had even formally begun, to wrap this up in her favor. It was something stripped of all of that, smaller, flatter, carrying none of the architecture that had been holding it up. The public, she said. I looked at her for one more moment, then I said 4 words. Then act like it. What happened after that was not a dramatic collapse. It was something quieter and in its own way, far more complete. The slow, visible deflation of a person watching the structure of their own invulnerability take itself apart in real time, with nothing to be done about any of it. She didn't sob, she went still. A different kind of still than the controlled stillness of 20 minutes earlier. The stillness of someone who has just understood with sudden and total clarity that the next 72 hours of their life are going to happen to them outside of their own control. For possibly the first time in 22 years, Diane Hargrove had no next move. And every camera in that room was pointed directly at her face as she arrived at that understanding. My ruling came without ceremony. Rosa Mendes was awarded full reinstatement, lost wages, legal fees, and emotional distress damages totaling $87,000, the maximum within this court's jurisdiction. The financial documentation regarding the Hargrove Community Foundation was formally referred to the State Attorney General's office for independent review. And then I addressed Diane directly, not about the merits of the case, but about what she had done inside this room. Mrs. Hargrove, in all my years on this bench, I have seen people attempt to use status, influence, and fear to redirect the course of justice. I want you to understand something clearly. This courtroom has no interest in reach. It has no interest in who oversees what department or which names appear on which foundation's donor list. What this courtroom has an interest in is what is right. And what is right has been sitting at that plaintiff's table since the moment these proceedings began, waiting patiently for someone to finally hear her. I noted formally for the record that the 2 references Diane had made to the commissioner's security oversight, once before proceedings opened, once during testimony, constituted attempted judicial intimidation, and that the full transcript would be forwarded to the Judicial Conduct Commission for review. The gavel came down. Rosa put her face in her hands and cried, not the composed kind, but the deep, full-bodied kind. The crying of a person who has been carrying something enormous for so long that the muscles required to hold it have forgotten what release feels like. Several audience members were in tears. The bailiff stared straight ahead with the rigid focus of a man working very hard to maintain his professional composure. Diane Hargrove gathered her things in silence, left the character reference letters on the table, left the leather folder, walked out without speaking to her attorney, without acknowledging Rosa, without the measured pace that had brought her in. The cameras caught her in the hallway afterward, standing completely still, not walking toward the elevator, not reaching for her phone, just standing, as if she had arrived somewhere unfamiliar and could no longer remember which direction she had meant to go. 90 days later, the world Diane had spent 22 years constructing came apart quietly and completely. The state attorney general opened a formal investigation into the Hargrove Foundation. Commissioner Richard Hargrove announced voluntary leave, a phrase that satisfied nobody. The two officers Rosa photographed were suspended. The school board chairman who initiated the fabricated charges against Rosa resigned before an ethics committee could compel his testimony. The attorney who had abandoned Rosa's case faced a bar inquiry. The charity gala season was canceled. The character reference letters vanished from public record. The city councilman stopped returning calls. Rosa went back to work. The settlement cleared her debt, secured her housing, and her license review was quietly dropped within 30 days. Her students made her a welcome back card. She keeps it on her desk next to her mother's photograph. People ask me sometimes what that day meant, what any of these days mean. Here is what I believe. Power used as a private weapon survives on one belief, that no room exists where its reach doesn't extend. Diane Hargrove had spent 22 years operating inside that belief, and for 22 years, she had been right. She walked into my courtroom that Tuesday morning because she was certain she would be right again. She forgot something. She forgot that the authority in this room does not belong to commissioners or foundations or donors or security details. It belongs to the people. To every Rosa Mendes, whoever did the right thing at great personal cost and came through a door hoping, simply hoping, that someone on the other side would be willing to listen. That is what this bench is for. That is what it has always been for. Subscribe because accountability always finds a door, and this courtroom will always be here when it does.